And now it's time for today's Power to the People expert panel on how U.S. forests will help us fight climate change. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished expert panel.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Drew Caputo. I am Vice President of Litigation at Earth Justice, and I have the honor of helping to lead Earth Justice's advocacy to protect public lands, wildlife, and oceans, and the wildlife and people who depend on them. We're here today to talk about mature and old growth forests and their value to fighting climate change and protecting biodiversity. Mature and old growth forests in different parts of America store more carbon per acre than tropical rainforests. They're also crucial habitat for a range of wildlife and crucial ecosystems for protecting biodiversity. For some indigenous communities, these forests also support a cultural heritage and way of life that stretches back for millennia. Unfortunately, though, these forests are still being logged today. We're here today to talk about the importance of these forests and what conserving them would mean for the climate, for biodiversity, and for indigenous communities. In order to address the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and to learn from indigenous communities, conserving mature and old growth forests has to be a central component of America's climate strategy. The US government needs to take action in order to do so. The good news is that a few months ago, the Forest Service, the US Forest Service, announced it would revisit a terrible Trump administration action to make it easier to log old growth forests, and that the new Forest Service would move toward stronger protections for the Tongass National Forest in Southeast Alaska. The Tongass is America's temperate rainforest. It's a climate refuge that holds a large amount of carbon in its ancient towering trees, and it's crucial habitat for wildlife. This is good early progress, but much more needs to be done in the face of the accelerating climate and biodiversity crises. Mature and old growth forests on public lands across the United States need stronger safeguards against logging. These areas include tribal hunting and fishing grounds, biodiversity hotspots, and refuges for wildlife that absorb climate pollution and can help us avoid the worst consequences of climate change. Today, we're fortunate to be able to hear from three panelists who bring really important perspectives to this conversation and can help us understand why protecting national forests is so crucial to our work to fight climate change and protect biodiversity. I'd like to introduce those panelists and have them say hello. First, we are very fortunate to have today Wanda Culp, who was born and raised in Juneau, Alaska, and who lives in Hoonah, Alaska. She is a Tlingit artist, activist, and advocate. She's a hunter, fisher, and gatherer of wild foods, a mother and a grandmother, and an artist, storyteller, cultural interpreter, and playwright. She co-produced the film Walking in Two Worlds. And Wanda, thank you so much for being here today. Wanda, what we refer to today as the Tongass National Forest is the ancestral homeland of Alaska Native people, including the Tlingit, who have stewarded the land for tens of thousands of years. Can you tell us about your personal connection to this forest and how it relates to your culture and identity?
My Tlingit name is Kashudoha, and I'd like to say that the Tlingit are the original settlers of this Tongass forests. My roots are Indigenous through a matrilineal relationship with the land. I'm from Glacier Bay. That's my original homeland, where we have over 16,000 years of history behind us. The Indigenous village settlements in the Tongass forest, every one of them are near rivers or the oceans, the waterways. We depend on the land and the water as well. Our cultural existence is a product of the Tongass forest environment. We have arisen from the forest. We are literally a part of the land dependent on its healthy habitat. We know of all the life cycles in our area. All of life is connected. We respect that. Our DNA literally requires the wild foods that we've been brought up on. Our Indigenous management falls within the laws of nature, and our knowledge comes from nature's intelligence that we have lost and now are striving to return back to. We require clean air, water, and land. I'd like to say that the life of the land is literally the life of the people.
Thank you so much, Wanda. Okay, now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Beverly Law, who is a professor emeritus at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. Dr. Law's research focuses on the effects of climate change, fire, and management on ecosystem, carbon, and water cycling. And she addresses issues such as the vulnerability of forests to drought-related mortality and the ecological implications of human actions intended to minimize drought and fire effects. She's been prolific, having authored or co-authored over 200 peer-reviewed publications, and she's in the top 1% of cited scientists on this subject matter. And she has testified before congressional committees on a variety of issues, such as managing forests in response to climate change. Dr. Law, the Tongass has been characterized as an essential carbon sink because its old growth trees are so effective at absorbing greenhouse gas emissions. Forests in the Pacific Northwest, where you live, are considered extremely important for the same reason. Can you explain why our national forests are so important when it comes to addressing climate change?
Well, mature and old forests hold the most carbon of all forests, and they keep it out of the atmosphere. And they continue to accumulate it over time, as they have over hundreds of years. So most of the old forests that we've found are on federal lands, particularly the national forests. And then mature and old forests in the Tongass and in the Pacific Northwest are high priority candidates for protection. The Tongass has a huge area, so it dominates in the total amount of ecosystem carbon that it holds. And the Pacific Northwest, western part of the forests of Oregon and Washington, have high carbon density, making them very, very valuable, although a lot of their forests are cut, so that area isn't entirely mature and old forests. So in the case of the Pacific Northwest forests, biodiversity increases a lot after age 80. So that's why we focus on mature and old, one of the reasons. And in the Tongass, there's abundant wildlife and species that have some of the species that have already disappeared or in the lower 48 states. So both of those areas, the Tongass and the Pacific Northwest, have a huge carbon benefit, as well as protection of biodiversity and prevention of further biodiversity loss. And one way we think about it, and we've written about in numerous papers, is we are proposing strategic climate reserves to protect these forests. And part of that reason for calling it that is something like our strategic petroleum reserves. They're there for emergencies. And we need to be able to protect forests for the long term, durable long-term protections for at least 100 years. Carbon in the forest and to minimize impacts on biodiversity. So they are probably the best candidates right now to start for starting a strategic climate reserve program. They're high priority in our analyses, and they should be high priority to the people.
Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Lauren Anderson, who is the Climate Forest Policy Coordinator at Oregon Wild. She previously worked in Washington, D.C. on federal climate and energy policy. Oregon Wild, her organization, protects and restores Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for future generations. And Lauren, we're so grateful to have you here today. Let me start with the first question for you. Could you discuss the current threat of logging facing mature and old growth forests, and why it's important that the Biden administration has committed through its international climate mitigation efforts to include forest protections in our nation's climate efforts?
Thank you so much for having me here today. While it's wonderful that the Biden administration has taken some initial actions to protect old growth in the Tongass National Forest, we still have a long ways to go. The same cannot be said for our national forests here in the Pacific Northwest, and especially for Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management lands in Western Oregon. Right now, there are numerous old growth sales that are moving forward. And we have to remember that here in our backyard in the Pacific Northwest, our forests represent a globally significant climate solution. Continuing to log our last remaining old forests on federal lands directly undermines some of the Biden administration's climate objectives, including his executive order on tackling the climate crisis and his efforts to protect 30% of lands and waters by 2030. We all know that reducing emissions alone is not going to be enough to address the climate crisis. The US must also pull and sequester significant amounts of legacy emissions from the atmosphere. And while there are numerous promising technologies that can help us meet this need in the future, right now, our best near-term opportunities are natural climate solutions like forests. The Biden administration recognized this challenge and called for additional forest protection specifically as part of the United States nationally determined contribution. By calling for these protections, President Biden has highlighted the importance of protecting forests alongside deploying technologies like wind and solar. And this represents a really important first step for these kinds of efforts.
Okay, thank you so much, Lauren. Wanda, if I could come back to you. Many people think of climate change, or at least historically have thought of climate change as something that's going to happen in the future. But the reality is that temperatures in Alaska, for example, are rising faster than other places around the globe. How is climate change affecting the landscape around you in Alaska?
The temperatures in Alaska are rising. The temperatures are too hot for us. Even if we get into the 70s and 80s, we're parched, but it gets warmer than that. And it doesn't get cold enough anymore. So that's threatening certain species of trees, like say, for instance, our yellow cedar that depends on the coldness of our atmosphere and our environment. Also, in Southeast Alaska, the weather, we have a new weather designation that I had never heard of before. Maybe it's been around, but it's called atmospheric river. So that while there's hot temperatures everywhere else, even in Alaska and lower 48, the connecting countries, we've been under literally a river of rain throughout this whole summer season, and the clouds are low, and we're not lacking this time in rain like we were a couple of years ago when I was literally scared to death of drought. So I'm not complaining about our atmospheric river, but I must say that it has caused heavy rains, heavy winds, heavy storms throughout all 4 seasons that we've never experienced before, so that there is no break in the storms and the harsh weather, wind, rain, strong storms. Our Glacier Bay and the ice cap around us is literally melting at an astonishing rate. It is so scary to see that we have no snow-covered mountains anymore year round. It used to happen all the time. Now we've got land exposed that for thousands of years never saw the light of day, but now is exposed. The food that we depend on, it's changing in texture. It's becoming a little bit more harsher, not as tender and sweet as it used to be. I believe it's because of the harsh weather conditions where we don't even have 4 seasons anymore. In the 1980s and 90s, the villages in Southeast Alaska were literally attacked through the Alaska Native land claims. Land was, we literally had the clear-cut logging industry around us. And those huge swaths of our hunting and fishing grounds were destroyed. Even today, 30 years, 40 years later, we have increased erosion that's destructing, so the destruction of our lands continues. Our salt waterways are being covered with silt, so that our marine life is being destroyed. And the trees are ending up in the water instead of on our land because of the erosion. So that's creating all kinds of hazards for traveling as well. Lack of salmon is a huge problem for us in the Tongass Forest because we are literally a salmon forest. All bit of life in the Tongass Forest relies on our salmon, and they are suffering. As soon as a salmon has trouble getting into our rivers and returning home, it's knocking all of the life we depend upon down. Our bears, our birds are down to the most minute life we don't see clearly. Everything is being fed to that salmon. And now that salmon is in peril. The stocks of salmon are diminishing. It's scary. This is the type of harsh reality we're facing. It's not gentle at all. It's red alert.
Well, it sure is a red alert, Wanda. Thank you for telling us about how things are looking on the ground in Alaska. Dr. Law, if I could turn to you to maybe address some of the scientific processes that are driving that on the ground experience. When we look around at the greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change, we know that deforestation is a major problem. Can you talk a little more about how logging has accelerated climate change and how preserving forests, especially mature and old growth trees, would alter this?
About a third of the carbon dioxide that we've added to the atmosphere over time has been from deforestation and degradation of land systems. And currently the emissions from humans and primarily from deforestation are about 15% of the total amount of carbon emissions that we put in the atmosphere. So it's a substantial amount. In the Western US, we did a study and found that medium to high carbon density forests and that were also low vulnerability to drought and fire in the future have a high priority for protection because they can account for as much as 30% of the global warming potential or global climate mitigation potential of all boreal and temperate forests. And that's a large contribution. And finally, protection of mature and old forests, especially those on federal lands, would be a low-cost way to meet climate goals. And it would protect threatened biodiversity. And really, we're seeing a lot of biodiversity loss, and it's accelerating, and it's a really disturbing thing. We have two crises to address: climate change and biodiversity loss. So permanent protections of carbon and biodiversity are best met on federal lands, particularly national forests. Those are the lands that are left.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Law. Lauren, let me turn to you. What specific actions can the Biden administration take right now to protect forests and in the process deal with climate change and protect biodiversity?
Yes, so there are actually numerous actions the Biden administration can take. The first step should be to use executive action to implement an old growth logging moratorium across all federal lands and pause all timber sales that are moving forward with mature and old growth forests. This is a critical first step, but they should then follow that step up with some truly ambitious natural climate solutions that they can implement nationwide, such as the strategic climate reserve that Dr. Law mentioned earlier. This is one of the best near-term solutions we have, and it should be implemented across all federal forests to protect remaining mature and old growth, both for biodiversity and as an essential carbon sink that we can help maintain into the future.
Okay, thank you so much, Lauren. Wanda, if I could turn to you again, I want to see if I could get your thoughts on how we might be able to make progress on some of those policy solutions using people power. A couple years ago, you traveled to Washington, D.C., along with other Alaska Native women, to meet with lawmakers about protecting the Tongass National Forest. What would be your message to those in power today?
Yes, thank you for that very good question. In 2019, 4 of us women from the Tongass villages went to DC. It was the first time that the lawmakers met face to face with our Indigenous women. And it was, I think it made a difference. We made an impact. Our messages were sent loud and clear how our lifestyles is, and very few of Americans realize that Alaska is full of living cultures, and living cultures on this earth today is threatened species, as many animals are too. So they were fascinated to know that we live off of the land yet, rather than polluted air and environment. I would strengthen our messages to them to be more urgent than they were 2 years ago. And like I said, red alert, red alert. It's all coming down on us so fast that we need fast action. We cannot take the time to ponder on this anymore. We need to call on our local, regional, statewide, national, and global action and begin listening to each other and initiating solutions, even if it starts from small Indigenous groups to the large authorities. We need to all work together globally. We've got a global warming going on. We've got a global pandemic. And the message is clear. Our earth is sick and we need to work on healthing this up. Codify the roadless rule into the books. This needs to be done. Right now, the roadless rule is like a hot potato and a political ploy, and we need to end that. We need to include tribal Indigenous management concepts into the federal governing process so that our concepts of preservation throughout the millennium is incorporated into the minds of land managers today. This is, I like what I'm hearing here about strategic climate resource. These are the kind of ideas we could all bring together and work together to make happen in this time of crisis. We're literally in a crisis.
We are in a crisis, Wanda. Thank you for making that clear so eloquently. Dr. Law, one of the things we hear from industry interests and others who are resisting taking action to protect forests in order to deal with the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. One of the things we hear from them is that the claim that we need to cut down more trees to protect us from fire. Can you address this idea and explain how old growth and carbon dense forests fit into the picture?
Well, first of all, only a small portion of total forest carbon is emitted to the atmosphere in wildfires. And we measured this on many fires and found that less than 10% of total ecosystem carbon was lost in Pacific Northwest fires. Then when they talk about thinning, it's not a thing that you do everywhere. Thinning to reduce fire severity removes about 1/3 to 1/2 of the tree biomass. It's a large amount of biomass. And 60 to 80% of that harvested carbon will return to the atmosphere faster than if you've just left it in the forest. That's because we don't know exactly where to thin and when to thin. But you may need to thin some dry forests to reduce fire risk, but that's removing only the small trees and leaving the large trees. It'll actually help some of the large trees because some of the small trees that are in the canopies could lead fire up to the crowns of the big trees. And in the Northwest and in Alaska, there are trees with very thick bark and tall canopies, and that makes them very fire resistant and drought resistant. So the other thing is that there's large scale thinning that's put forward, and large scale thinning of forests to reduce fire risk conflicts with climate goals. And that's because the amount of carbon that's removed from forests by thinning is much larger than that saved from fires. And so more area is harvested than actually burned because they don't know exactly where to do this. So it puts most of that harvested carbon back into the atmosphere really quickly. And mature and old forests in the rainy Tongass and Pacific Northwest are really resistant to these fires. And so there isn't much need to do it. They have very long fire return intervals. It's 100 to 350 years. So that doesn't make sense. So a lot of actions that have been proposed are not really for the good of the ecosystems. And if you do something like thinning, it's very, very conservatively used in the driest of systems and the systems that need a little more help. But really, the protection of the mature and old forests is essential across the US. And it needs to be done really quickly because we're running out of time for climate action. These forests are already doing their job. Let them continue doing their job.
Lauren, Dr. Law just made a powerful case that we're running out of time for climate action. For those listening today, what's the best action people can take now to help steer us toward greater forest preservation in order to fight climate change and the biodiversity crisis?
So it's absolutely true that we need to take big actions as soon as possible on climate change. We have to do things like electrify our entire transportation sector, decarbonize our entire electricity sector, along with other massive transformations across our economy and society. When you think about mature and old growth protections compared to some of these incredibly challenging goals that we're aiming for, it really represents low-hanging fruit. This is common sense, it's cost-effective, it should have been done a very long time ago, and it is one of the best near-term solutions we have to fight climate change. So again, the Biden administration needs to take immediate action to stop logging our old forests that we have left. And one of the best things you can do is to call on the Biden administration and his climate team, including Gina McCarthy and John Kerry, and ask them to take this step, especially going into the International Climate Conference in Glasgow, Scotland this year.
Lauren, how does what you've proposed for action represent a different way of thinking about climate solutions?
So in the past, when we've approached conservation issues, we've really focused on things like wildlife conservation, ensuring clean water, and protecting our public lands. And I think it's really important to take a different approach to climate solutions and make sure that they are interwoven amongst all of those traditional conservation efforts. So when we protect our forests, we're protecting biodiversity and clean and abundant water for communities, but we're also banking carbon in the long term and establishing this new concept of climate protections on public lands. And so while this is a slightly different way of looking at things than they have been done in the past, I think that it is a critical first step forward for the conservation community as a whole and environmentalists to really modernize how they think about natural climate solutions within this broader context.
And if I understand you correctly, Lauren, one of the things you're saying is that you're interweaving, the right approach interweaves addressing climate, addressing biodiversity, addressing human needs in an interrelated, interwoven way of addressing the problems we face. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. Natural climate solutions offer numerous co-benefits that go along with storing and sequestering carbon. And these are really important considerations moving forward to ensure climate resiliency and healthy communities far into the future.
Okay, well, I really appreciate that. And I cannot think of three people I would rather hear from in order to learn about these threats and opportunities. So Wanda Culp and Dr. Beverly Law and Lauren Anderson, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to all the folks who are here as viewers.
Thank you for joining us. We are Earth Justice, wielding the power of law and the strength of partnership to protect people's health, to preserve magnificent places and wildlife, to advance clean energy, and to combat climate change. We're here because the Earth needs a good lawyer. Earth Justice. Learn more at earthjustice.org/02100 and take action by texting climate to 43428.